Good afternoon. Welcome. So glad you could join us for this discussion. I just want to introduce myself quickly. My name is Angie McKenzie. I'll be moderating today. I have a deep background in food and beverage, spent my career working in that space. I specialize in innovation and product design, having worked for companies like Starbucks Coffee Company and the National Food Lab. So this is a subject that I'm super interested in, and I'm thrilled to be able to moderate this discussion about independent coffee houses and COVID-19. So I'd like to introduce the panel today. Joining us today, we have Dane Atkinson, CEO of Odeko, Andrea Ramirez, Trends and Insights expert from Tarani, Dan Price, founder and CEO of Gravity Payments, and Nick Martin, the CEO of Joe. So that's our panel. Let's jump in and get started. So I'll throw the first question out there. So we've been living in this new reality of COVID-19 for months now. Seems like years, but it's been months. And there's been a lot of discussions about what's working for indie coffee houses and what's not. But it's useful, I think, to look at what the data says. So we have some folks here on the call that can talk to us about the data. And so I think I'll jump to Dan first to talk to us a little bit about what the data says.
Oh, did you say me, Angie? Sorry, I cut out for a second. Well, I mean, the data broadly is that it's been really challenging. I mean, we've seen a lot of coffee shops lose a significant portion of their revenue, but there are some that are outperforming the market and some that are underperforming the market. And so the good news is that there are things that independent coffee shops can do to beat kind of the macro data. So it's a challenging time, I would say, but it's a time when a focus on what can I do, how can I make a difference here, can lead to things like keeping on an extra employee, keeping a customer relationship that maybe is tempted to start checking out a new coffee shop because because they're following better safety guidelines, or they have better opening and availability, or they have a more seamless checkout procedure. Those are the types of things that we see where all of a sudden it's a shift. And so, this is a horrible situation with the pandemic, and it's hurtful to all of us, but it's not kind of equally hurtful to all coffee shops. So that's important to recognize. And some have it harder than others, particularly coffee shops that are in kind of center downtown areas. Those are ones that are sometimes have a more difficult go of it. But what's true across the board with all coffee shops is all of a sudden, making the quality of the cup of coffee just that little bit better is less of a competition point for now, and making the experience of checkout, safety, having the customer kind of feel good about the experience. And, for myself personally, when I get handed that cortado that I love, it's a great feeling. But moving the payment outside of the four walls of the store does not at all take away from my experience. So those are the types of things that we're seeing in the data, is the shops that put the effort in to be safe and to provide both the perception of and the reality of safety for their customers are outperforming the very difficult macro situation.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks, Dan. Nick, did you want to add what you've been seeing as well?
Yeah, for sure. I think like the difference with our business is, Dan sees 100% of the in-person transaction data, and we see 100% of the data that's ordered ahead. And so we don't always have that complement of in-person, although that will be changing here in the near future. But what we've seen, looking at our data, it was really interesting. I think in a world where folks are wanting to avoid crowded spaces and really embracing contactless pickup and things like that, we saw this just massive, the appetite for mobile order ahead and things like that just dramatically increased. So almost overnight, we saw the rate of sort of new users per store that are ordering ahead increase 20-fold and not slow down basically overnight as sort of news broke with COVID. And we've always kind of had this, you know, we're building this business with the idea that like, hey, in 5 years, we think that, you know, order ahead for pickup in coffee will really follow a similar curve to what we saw with delivery in casual restaurant space, which is, you know, over half of all consumption is off premise now. It increased the size of the overall pie for that category by 3x. And so what we're kind of seeing is what we thought was going to take 3-5 years to catch up, and even for independent coffee to catch up with the experience that a Starbucks was having pre-COVID, with over 20% of their transactions being order ahead. We kind of just you know, ran face first into it, and it kind of happened over a couple months. You know, so it was a behavior that we knew was coming. I think everybody sees that that's kind of where consumer behavior is coming, and it just kind of went much faster. So I think for us, you know, from Joe's experience, being able to sort of be a lifeline, and it's been for coffee shops, and seeing the shops that really aggressively went after changing and evolving and adapting their core business to really accommodate that scenario. When, you know, Dan mentioned the folks that sort of outperform the market and folks that haven't, the folks that have been really aggressive in that and embraced it sort of wholly right away, we've seen be able to maintain a pretty healthy business. So a couple examples, we have a few blog posts just because we're trying to share learnings that we get and get it out to other folks. If you check out the blog, there's some customer stories and best practices that you can check out. But a Dark Matter Coffee in Chicago is a good example. A Blue Star Coffee in Twisk, Washington, a small town. You know, they both went either only mobile order ahead or really near to mobile order ahead, and have been able to maintain 75 to 100% of pre-COVID revenue. So some good, you know, some silver linings there. And although, you know, acknowledging that it's still, regardless, a tough time, and everybody's facing these really tough headwinds, but behavior's changing. Kind of see a full shift that came a lot sooner than we thought.
Excellent. It's good to hear those individual success stories and kind of take those learnings and translate them. I want to mention something really quickly so I don't forget. So for the attendees, if you have questions throughout this, you see that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can pop your questions in there, and we'll be taking a look at them. And at the very end, we'll have time to go through some of those questions. So make sure you put your questions in the Q&A. And then also, because you're probably scribbling and taking notes, the recording is going to be sent to the attendees. So I just want to make sure people realize that. So keeping the discussion going. So you have the data that gives you some of the story. What other trends are you seeing just based on your interactions with clients? You guys all have your fingers on the pulse of what's going on. Maybe Dane, you can talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, happy to. So I think we've seen the same thing from the data standpoint, so I won't go over what Dan and Nick just said, but mobile ordering is an essential. Like, there's none of our customers who are doing anything unless they're doing that. And we do see the same thing. We see the market down about 60%. In New York City, it's down about 23% of pre-COVID numbers. There is a shift, which is also just geographically based, which is, you know, our subways in New York are down to 5% to 8% of their previous traffic. So a lot of those terminuses just don't work anymore. And we see residential markets doing much better because they've got footprints that are obviously suitable. But beyond that, to double up on what Nick's saying, the people who've done the most have been the aggressive players, right? So maybe in the long term, those who've been staying closed actually may win, but we've seen a number of customers like Go Get 'em Tiger who decided that they're going to just become a deli. So they are servicing not just, you know, the standard coffee products, but we've seen a basket size increase for all of our customers, about 40%. And for them, it's almost doubled. And for other brands like them, they've been able to add a lot of other items into the mix, which has really helped. A lot of order ahead stuff has helped a lot too. I also have make sure you've got beans and other products that are really there. And then to what Dan was saying earlier, diving in this time, I think earning that relationship with customers will pay off in the long term. So in New York, we set up a thing called New York Loves Coffee, where patrons could buy coffee for hospitals. We gave out 40,000 coffees over the last month or so, or 2 months. And that's turned out to be a really big win for the brands that jumped in on that, because they help become part of that community story. And that's now been transitioned to the protest engine. So they're supplying supplies for them. And I think it's a really great way. If you don't make the same economics you did, although there is economics associated to it, but you really build your customer base. And what we'd seen before COVID was that the average shop had about 900 recurring customers, and that has dropped. But in populations that have really leaned in, those populations have actually grown. So there's a lot more diversity in their customer base. So find ways to make it work, be creative, save small business, because without it, we're all screwed. Please save us all.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for that. Nick, maybe you want to expand on that a little bit, and also maybe weave in a little bit more about a bit what Dane touched on, which is companies shifting a bit, the coffee house shifting to a deli, shifting in ways that are helping them to be more successful during this time.
Absolutely. So yeah, just piggybacking, big push for much more at-home consumption through coffee shops. So some of the interesting things we saw in our app is we have an upsell feature. So just like your barista upsells at checkout, we do that through the app automatically. And seeing what items coffee shop owners select changed a lot because the context changed. So instead of upselling a scone with your Americano, you're seeing a bag of beans so you can take home, because, hey, if you are gonna, it's from a health perspective, I think customers and shop owners are like, if you're gonna spend $30 through my shop this week, why not do it all up front rather than coming in and risking exposure multiple times, that sort of a thing. So that's been really big. I think I think what's been really inspiring to see is that I think the numbers don't necessarily reflect is that even as volume's down, we really see communities really stepping up to support those small businesses and support the coffee shop. So we've seen barista tips gone up over 250% through the app during this time. We had a wave of, to reduce fraud, we had a cap on the amount of tips, and we had a huge influx of folks asking us to remove the cap because they want to tip as much as possible to their baristas, which was really exciting to see. The other big things that we saw just kind of pop up overnight was, leveraging this position of a community staple, that you have a relationship and people look for you and trust for you to kind of be there. And as these grocery lines get really long and they're managing how many folks can walk into grocery stores, South LA Cafe is a really good example of one that, popped up a grocery store and sourced from local providers, whether it's the local butcher and really locally sourced produce and that sort of a thing, got these much smaller footprint supply chains to provide these staples that folks were waiting hours and hours in line to get the basics in their fridge. So that was really incredible. We saw a 40% increase in average ticket size as a result of a combination of these things. So before we already had average ticket of a little over $10. Now that's knocking around $15 for order ahead purchases. So a combination of really interesting things. The last really big trend we see that technically people are kind of hacking the Joe app to do this, but is to enable local delivery, right? So we actually went and we added more space in the app where you can add your gift cards and merchandise and all these things. And they're using that to do at the end of the day, if you're within 3 to 5 miles of a coffee shop, hey, we'll drop off, wholesale, beans and homebrew stuff, or our bottled cold brew that we're doing, and really boost revenue and cash flow kind of at the end of the day with a really constrained kind of geography there. So that's something that we see that's probably not going to go away. A lot of these things are experiences, I think, and if we think about the silver lining, once you get exposed to a really cool experience, those things aren't going to go away. Consumers are going to continue to want that, and hopefully shop owners are seeing the benefit from the business, and it's something that's going to last afterwards as well.
Right. Excellent. So it sounds like there's a lot of people needing to be nimble and inventive from the coffee house side of the equation. And it's good that you at Joe are being able to respond to what you're seeing and being nimble with the service that you're offering. So there's it seems like there's a lot of shifting behaviors going on, and folks who are just trying to tap into that. So if we think about priorities with customers, how, I guess the larger question is, how are priorities shifting, and what do we think it's gonna look like on the other side of this? Are there gonna be new priorities that are becoming important for customers? And I'd love to hear from Andrea, since she focuses on this very space.
Sure. So we really expect one of the very first behaviors as shops are opening up is this really increased need for showing really overt safety, overt hygiene, overt sanitization, so that your guests can really feel safe just going back. I mean, it's a very baseline thing, but making sure that there are hand sanitizing stations, that there are gloves being worn and masks, all of those to really build that immediate level of comfort. I think that is something that will probably still go along for the next several months, especially as we keep hearing about a second wave potentially happening and hitting and impacting everyone. But then we start to see a little bit more in, and also some of these behaviors of what kinds of drinks people are even wanting. So it's going back to some of these very familiar, very traditional flavors that maybe we couldn't get at home, or that are maybe really exciting to just go back to have. We've started to see operators offering large format beverages, which I think is a really interesting way to let their guests interact with their brands every single day, but maybe they don't have to make that difficult leap outside of the house, right? But they can still have their large multi-format latte that maybe is just poured in a cup over the course of a week. So it is really interesting to see the different types of things. I think there's also going to be a lot more interest in interacting with the brands that have helped serve the community from the very beginning. How have they helped? How have they offered support for their local community as well? And then another piece is especially looking at sort of the younger consumers who do tend to really be heavy users of coffee shops. So thinking of those Gen Zs and younger millennials, you know, people maybe 32 and under, a lot of them have been very heavily impacted by the economic conditions. Whether they worked in food service, they may not have the very easy option like someone such as myself has of working from home. And so economic conditions are another stronger thing. So I do expect in probably the next 6 months or so, there will be more of a pivot toward value as being another important piece.
Excellent. It's interesting to heard that a couple times about the large format offering, and that's certainly playing out in restaurants, at least here in California. I don't know if that's all over, where restaurants are serving large format cocktails, giant margaritas, which I think are supposed to be consumed over time, but you know, there's no judgment here. So
hey, Andrew, one thing that I wanted to add as well, actually two things. One is, like, as a business owner myself, I've been trying to challenge myself, because I realize there's so many assumptions that I make, and it's kind of like necessary in a way. You know, I can't remember what the statistic is, but supposedly we block out like 99 point something% of all information that comes in. And we focus on those one or two things so that we can really like make a difference there. But I think that in 2020, a lot of the assumptions that I made about life or my business are being challenged, but I don't know which ones. And so for myself as a business owner, like all of these kind of like rules or edicts about like the right way to run a business or the right way to run a coffee shop, even, I'm not a coffee shop owner, but I wonder how many of them are still true. And I suspect most are still true, but some are not. And that we don't yet fully know which ones are and which ones are not. So I've been putting a lot of effort into trying to figure out what are those assumptions that have changed. And Andrea and Dane, both of what you said really, you know, kind of carried that home for me about like, oh, because before I wouldn't have done this, but now maybe I should, is interesting. And then the other thing that I think about a lot is the employee experience. Because when I'm going into coffee shops as a consumer, that interaction with the employee all of a sudden has so much importance to me as a human being, because I don't get much interaction with other people at that kind of a distance right now. I've been strictly distancing now for 4 months. And so it's really precious, that interaction. And so having the coffee shop, you know, have really engaged employees. And in my mind, the way we've been trying to do that at Gravity, because we have a similar issue, we have 20,000 small businesses that we support. We have 200 employees that support them. And we need that human interaction and not create stress for those 20,000 small businesses that are already under so much stress. So we've been leaning in really hard to letting, or asking actually our employees to make the biggest company decisions for how we deal with things. And one is because I think that our 200 people are much smarter than I am if we all work together collectively. But the second reason is if we're in it together, I think we will just have a better human experience for our customers who are so stressed right now. And I bet a lot of the coffee shop owners that are on the conference call right now are there's a lot of stress that they're dealing with in their life. So just having, you know, positive interactions that take away stress, that simplify things. I've just been thinking about those things a lot.
Yeah, that's super important. Andrea, were you going to add something there? You look like you were starting to. You're on mute.
Thank you. Yes, I was. So one of the things Dan just said actually did make me think, so I had to take a little note. But about one of the really large changes that we have started to see over the last 3 to 5 years is this move, especially in the coffee space, toward more sustainability, more reusable cup programs, right? More, you know, in California, of course, you've had to pay for your bags when you're grocery shopping, and all of that has gone out the window. And so the move toward single-use items, again, is it compostable? It's a question that I'm really wondering how long that particular impact will be a part of it, because it's certainly something that, you know, we even are very conscious of in the office as well, where we still don't have full capacity there. But, you know,
Yeah.
what do you do with reusable cups? Because we certainly don't want them. We don't want to share them. We don't want things that other people have touched.
Right. It's sort of shaking everything up.
Right.
Great insights there in terms of delivery. And then, you know, Dan, and what you hit on is that connection piece. So, you know, maybe reevaluating what that connection looks like, because we have a lot of assumptions, you know, the third place experience and what aspects are meaningful, what points of connection are meaningful. So maybe we can talk a little bit about creating community and building relationships, you know, as we increasingly go digital. And what does that look like in a coffee shop if you can't hang out? You hit on it a little bit, Dan, but maybe we can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so there's a certain type of technology that goes with kind of the private equity way of running a business, which the private equity way of running a business is basically to buy a company and then squeeze everybody, lay off employees, increase prices, make the consumer experience slightly worse, and make more money as a result of all those things. And so there's a certain type of technology that goes with that, where basically it allows you to lay off workers or eliminate jobs. And I personally hate that type of technology. I'm not that interested in being a part of it. And I'm personally willing to sacrifice whatever amount of money I need to not be a part of it. But the type of technology that I'm intrigued by is the type of technology that allows the employees to actually focus on exactly what you just touched on, Angie. And I think if you, for example, automate and make seamless the payment experience or any other types of experiences in the shop, it kind of changes the way that the job is framed for that employee. Because instead of like completing one more task, there's kind of, the job gets boiled down to two things. Number one, I'm an artist. What I make is unique and individual. And the reason why the consumer's buying it is because this is going to be a one of a kind thing. Now, yes, there's going to be some standardization. They're going to get that experience, but just the little touches is going to be a little bit different every time. So I like technology that enables that artistic approach to business. And then secondly, how can I connect with our customers and have more empathy for our customers for what they're going through? I think, and one of the reasons why I personally took $1 million pay cut to institute a $70,000 living wage at Gravity is because I want that employee to see themselves as that valuable connector, not as just somebody who, you know, a robot tells them what to do, like an Amazon factory or distribution center, but I want them to see themselves as somebody who is absorbing information, is connecting authentically, is connecting on a human level. And ultimately, I think with the way the world's going, I think that's going to be more scarce and more valuable in the future. And I think the coffee industry has a role to play in preserving that humanity in business.
Sure, sure. Excellent. I see you nodding, Nick. Do you want to jump in there?
Yeah. Oh man, I couldn't agree more with what Dan just said. And I think, you know, one of the conversations that we have a lot, and I think that maybe coffee shop owners are wrestling with right now as we move to like a more contactless spaces, you know, we create these businesses because we want to create really great experiences for customers and exceptional product. And that's what is the lifeblood of this space. And with that, you know, one of the conversations we'd have a lot with is, well, hey, if I'm taking away this transaction at the point of sale, then, you know, how am I building relationships? And I think that the way to sort of evolve thinking on that is we have these great baristas that should be focusing on building relationships and creating awesome product and awesome experiences for your customers. And that is not that, you know, the best part of that engagement between customer and barista isn't relaying information into hardware and punching it and then turning it around and asking them to sign and that sort of thing. So by freeing up, these are things that I think are going to accelerate and enhance relationships. So now, you know, when you can order ahead and take out all that time that's spent tapping into a tablet and waiting for the card to process, and instead you can go to the other side of the bar and have a conversation with your barista while they're making your drink. You can ask them about it. You can explore different items on the menu and have that aspect of it. We really see these as relationship builders. The other piece is, you know, when you can take away that time and you can take away that part of that friction, now suddenly you're showing up more often, right? This is, I think, one of the biggest things here and one of the biggest opportunities moving forward is that by lowering barriers, like in anything, right? If you go outside to coffee and you're like, my gosh, how many purchases of online ordering have I done, you know, from like an e-commerce side, whether it's, you know, ordering online from Target or Amazon or whatever. You do it more often because it's easier and it's impulsive, and there's more scenarios throughout your day where you can fit it in. And coming out the other side of this thing, you know, if customers, you know, come in person to a coffee shop 4 days a week, when they remove this friction, now they're coming in an additional 2 or 3 times a week. Those are incremental relationship builders and incremental touch points that I think are important to think about, and you can do those in a really meaningful way.
Right. So really focusing on those value-added activities and value-added connections, and freeing up employees, thinking about both parts of the equation, how employees are experiencing it and how customers are experiencing it as well. So I want to leave some time for questions at the end, but I also want to get this one last question in here about what's next. How do you think coffee shop owners can prepare for what's next, whether that's reopening or a second wave? Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. Who should I go to as we're winding up? Any volunteers here?
I'll jump in.
Oh yeah, go ahead. You go ahead. I've been talking.
Well, I think one of the bigger things is prior to the pandemic, there really had been a shift of how people use food service and coffee shops to a more non-traditional use that was around off-premise. So it was maybe using a coffee house for a takeout occasion or a drive-through or for catering. And that was something that was increasing prior. And now that was sort of the only way you could shop. So I would really expect that non-traditional use to continue to grow, because that type of behavior has really been reinforced with consumers over these last few months. And again, just seeing, I think, more about, I would expect more just continued implementation of, that touch-free ordering technology, new operational models for touch-free experiences in there are all going to continue to be really important going forward, and probably more on a long-term basis.
If I could just jump in. Oh yeah. So, let me just say real quick, I want to tee it up for you, Dane, actually, as part of this, because I think what your business does at Odeco is so much part of the formula for a lot of this moving forward. And I'll keep this real brief, but I think the opportunity right now and into the near future is, and what, at Joe, we're thinking about it this way, but I think it's important for coffee shops owners too, is to be thinking about, this is an opportunity to take risks and innovate. And I think the folks that do that right now are going to be in a much stronger position. So you have, companies like Odeco that are finding out ways to make you more competitive on the supply side, and how do we decrease costs. You have businesses like Gravity and Dan who are really stepping up for small businesses as well. But in parallel, Starbucks just shut down 400 locations, and they're reopening a large segment of those as mobile order ahead only. They're using this as an opportunity to do things that maybe they would have been more risk averse to, and because customers are more tolerant and will embrace these new experiences now more than ever. And I think that's an opportunity that coffee shop owners should be thinking about.
Just thank you for the plug. That was super awesome. And to throw it back, I think to Dan's point, finding a way to build a new infrastructure for this future is really important. So getting a business that aligns with your sensitivities and really has that human connection, I think it's a big part of it. I also think that all of our crystal balls are bust. Like, I used to feel like I knew what the universe is gonna look like, and I have no idea. Second, third wave, like it's gonna be a mess. I would say finding agility in your thinking, and that's one of the things that small businesses are literally the very best at. So like in New York, we've been driving a few tests. We taken a couple of coffee shops and we strapped them into trucks. We took a coffee shop and we put it into a trolley and we walked it around and we put them in front of places to try to sell things. We created a micro delivery service because we found out that a lot of the pickups were actually happening with like a 5-block radius of our shop. So we created those delivery services, and that all those 3 programs have worked so far. We've also blasted out the windows in a lot of New York places so we could create this new open air environment, because they usually have big storefront glass so that you could sort of have a seating or hangout where you see other human beings, but then we circled spots on the ground so that you would be somewhat socially distanced. I think I don't think any of us are smart enough to know what the hell's going to happen. But certainly seeing how small businesses invent the new things is what will become the next trend. And to put a positive spin on the forest fire we're all in, those folks who can survive through this and figure it out will tend to plant the next garden, right? Like there will be so many businesses that'll explode into this new chapter. Just fighting and finding a way to make it through as a small business is the most important thing. Because we don't want it just to be Starbucks. No offense, Angie, but I don't want it just to be Starbucks.
It's okay. No offense.
I'll say too, Angie, just to +1 to that, I do think there is a threat that we have kind of systemically, because the larger businesses have increased their financial advantage so much. And there's a lot of products out there that allow small businesses to engage in digital commerce that have kind of a monopoly mentality. What I mean by that is they basically want to do a land grab and then increase the prices and decrease the experience. And we've seen this over and over again. And the way to really know about that is if you listen to a lot of technology companies, if you listen to what they say to their investors, they won't broadcast that to their customers or employees, but they broadcast in code somewhat that they're doing that to their investors. So I think, how do we overcome that? Because it's a major challenge. I think aligning yourself with a company that has similar values or have values that's compatible with what you want is so important in 2020 in maybe a way that it wasn't in 2010 or 2000. Because I think that advantage, that leverage that the larger companies are willing to take against smaller companies and against just individuals is so much larger now in 2020 than ever before. And I think by just being vulnerable with each other, like growing together, being willing to overcome some obstacles together, to work with companies and have relationships where there is that deep values alignment for the long term, I think can help implement some of these strategies.
Excellent, excellent. Well, it sort of takes me to one of the questions that came from the attendees, and that is, as we think about that relationship with customers and values, how are marketing efforts changing during COVID? Any marketing advice for these coffee houses?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. I think, and this also sort of speaks to the point about how our relationship sort of evolving between customers and coffee shops, but social media, Instagram specifically, it was already a main marketing channel for these coffee shops, but we're seeing shops really double and triple down and being much more aggressive around promotions and deals and happy hours and things like that, and orienting them around things that make sense, right? So like before it was deals on a latte, and now it's deals on bags of beans or homebrew equipment or even swag. Like folks want to step up and really support and engage and build deeper connections with those coffee shops that they know and love. So selling, I think merchandise right now is selling a lot quicker, and gift cards are selling a lot quicker, and those social media channels and being creative about that. And I think the other thing is, before there was much more, an emphasis on like, well, it's about building our brand and things like that. We're seeing a lot of shops having a ton of success. Anthem Coffee is a good example of one. South LA Cafe, who I mentioned before, but putting the owner and the owner story at the forefront of your social media efforts and showing and being honest about the struggle and the reality of what's happening right now, I think is a real opportunity in a really authentic and real way to just connect with customers and let them know why it's so important to support small business. And I mean, these are stories. This is a business we get into because we're passionate about connecting people and creating spaces where people feel like they belong. And that's something that these big chains cannot match and is really threatened right now, I think, to Dan's point. And so I think being bold and being comfortable with putting that story out front and connecting in really authentic ways with your customers is important.
Anybody else have anything to add there? I thought I saw some. No? Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Thank you for that, Nick. So here's another one. So will we see a rise in fully automated zero-touch coffee dispensers moving forward? There might be a part two here, hang on. How payments will evolve to support contactless, seamless payment? So basically not touching anything.
I would say that the zero touch, Dane, it looks like you disagree, but I think that will be probably in the convenience store space, not the specialty cafe space, but within C-store.
Sure. Dane, Nick, do you have
I mean, we have lots of friends that make the robots because we're the geeks. So Truebird, a bunch of companies are making huge machines. Our vision of coffee is what Dan was saying before, is it's part of the human connection, and we desperately want to see that remain as the future. I agree, Andrea, there's probably going to be robots in our shopping markets, and I'll get my coffee there rarely, but No losing humans.
Right.
Humans don't have to count. That's one of our things, but they have to be there.
Yes.
I think too, Angie, one point of context that I would add in looking at what's next is what the reality of the situation is right now. In terms of how the pandemic is affecting people, what people's financial situation is, the level of fairness and justice, in some ways is at more of a low point than a high point right now. That's not true in every way, but there are certain ways where that's kind of at a low point as opposed to a high point. And also, there appears to be some sort of awakening that's happening because, well, the pendulum maybe has swung so far in that direction around kind of inequality that I think people are starting to realize how harmful that is systemically.
Sure.
And of course, economists have been pointing that out for a very long time. But I think that message is finally starting to get to kind of everyday consumers. And I think there's a story to tell there for an independent coffee shop about like what their social stance is. I think previously, like businesses were not always expected to take a social stance or to be involved socially. But I think what you have is you have a good percentage of your consumers, their income was not interrupted by the pandemic. Maybe they're feeling stir crazy because they're staying home more. In some cases, they got a stimulus check. All their commute expenses have gone away. All of their travel expenses have gone away. So the savings rate is something like 10 times higher right now than it was 5 months ago. And yet you have extreme kind of desperation, things like homelessness, a lack of access to basic health care, including mental health care. And you have these two kind of opposite forces kind of so obviously converging right now in our minds. And I think we're really grappling with that as a society. So to the extent that you can, as a coffee shop, understand that many of your consumers really want to support you and also want to support your employees. I think that's a benefit contextually. And then also to the extent that you can take some of that outside of the walls of your business and show how these issues matter to you personally, how you get it. I think the sense of connection and empathy you can create with those consumers who are having that big wake-up call right now could be a really powerful connection point on a human level that also leads to a business relationship.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much for that. Nick, did you have something to add there?
Oh, yeah, well, I was just, more specific. Well, gosh, all of a sudden everything that I was going to say seems a lot less cool now with that deep take from Dan there. But I will also specifically around, I mean, we do have a position on sort of the contactless piece and the robots piece. I very much echo the sentiment from Dane and Dan on this in terms of like relationships are what make coffee specifically special, right? And so like the broader food service category, I think that there are contextual differences that don't apply to coffee because it's so much built on relationships. And I mean, how many baristas or how many owners here know the drink, the favorite drink of the person as they walk through the door? Like when I was a barista, I knew more folks by the drink that they got every single day than their first name, actually, because that's just, and I knew their story and I knew about, their kids going off to college and how they're worrying about that. Those are special things that it's as much about that experience as it is about the coffee that you serve them, if not more. And so I think that's kind of the position there. From the contactless point of view, I mean, we've taken the position that the world is moving towards a mobile first world, right? So we partnered with Gravity Payments on this strategic project to bring a point of sale to market that really makes sense. One, for what we're evolving to, which is a mobile first world, which includes scenarios that make it really easy to have completely 100% contactless payments. And that's a core scenario that we're building our POS around that will be live here in a couple of months. And so I think that was something that was inevitable. Like, I think it falls into the bucket of like these types of experiences and how you have those transactions. This is evolving and changing, and it was going that direction already. It might be accelerated now, but in our view, the ability to order and not touch any hardware at that point of sale is something that was going to happen. I think will happen a lot faster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think probably people had concerns about that some people had concerns about that before any of this happened. And so I imagine that will be a lasting impact. And just, circling back around to what you said, Dan, because that was a really powerful comment about just finding those connection points that have meaning for people, and really, doing what independent coffee houses do best with those relationships, and just trying to understand how to show up for their community and how to express their values. So I wanted to make sure to circle back around to that, because that does feel super important in a totally different direction. Because at the end of the day, they have these businesses to run, right? So here's a question. As a coffee shop owner, we now have even more costs to keep our establishment sanitized. New signage is needed for customer flow and the cost of new technology. Do you anticipate shops increasing prices?
So Angie, I'll tell you, my best friend Joe, no relation to Joe Coffee, he owns the top-rated specialty coffee shop in Boise, Idaho. It's called Slow by Slow, and that's kind of the closest, like, to a hometown I have, because I grew up in rural Idaho, about an hour from Boise. And one of the reasons why we made the decision at Gravity to invest $500,000 to bring these tools and technology to independent coffee shops recently with Joe Coffee is Square, which really does take that monopoly type approach. They announced that they were increasing their fee to small coffee shops by 10 cents per transaction across the board with very little notice, which is a really unfortunate thing. And just before that announcement happened, I was going out to lunch with Joe, and he was explaining to me how, how the economics of his business work and everything. And, he really has to budget like every aspect of his life, because it's not easy to run a specialty coffee shop in Boise, Idaho. Even though he is remarkably successful, the financial rewards to him are not at the same level as if he had that similar level of success in like a technology business or some other type of business. And so that 10-cent increase for him basically took his business from being viable to not viable pretty quickly. And so we were really stressed about it and worried about it, but he ended up increasing his prices to pass it on to all of those consumers. And I hated that he had to do that, which is partly why we made this big investment to try to fight that type of behavior from Square. But, I asked him how it went, and he said the price increase did not affect any of his customer relationships of what he could see. So I think that most consumers right now that are in the category of having an okay financial situation are pretty understanding from what I've seen. I have seen some few and far between that aren't understanding, but I've seen just a huge understanding of, I think, the honesty and the vulnerability from the small business community about how difficult that is to make those ends meet, and understanding that, if you have enough money, being willing to pay a little bit higher price to preserve that is absolutely worth it.
Right.
Sorry to add in on that one. So we did an elasticity study, sort of the price tolerance of the market pre-COVID, and it was shocking how much the category had underpriced itself in major urban areas and even rural areas. So I think that coffee owners, being the best humans on the planet, they just want to make sure they're giving a fair deal, and they often not seeing their own business, their own people. So we would highly encourage it. We learned an interesting lesson though from one of our customers, Birch, here in New York, which is in this time, there's also a segment of the population that's getting really wiped out economically. So the program they sort of came up with was that they were going to make sure that they had a quality coffee experience that was low price. And then for Dan's cortado that he likes, they jacked that price up. So they kind of kept the straight coffee at a low volume and lifted the price to get their basket size up, because you can lift the price, but trying to make sure there's a space for people who may not have as much right now.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting thinking about that relationship of pricing, strategies, and perception of value. Andrew, you talked about value being important moving forward, and that makes me think about sort of loyalty. programs. So being able to sort of reward those customers and make sure that even if the prices are going up, that there are other elements that provide value. Maybe Nick, do you want to talk about that area?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, at the heart of what we're building with Joe is around those relationships. And so, I mean, our whole philosophy is like, hey, how do we go about putting this system that is driving almost all same-store revenue growth for Starbucks into the hands of independent coffee shops to deliver really what we think is a better experience when you consider the diversity of experiences and product and all these things and the relationships that come with that. And at the core of that is a rewards program that we are getting increasingly sophisticated to increase revenue per customer that uses the app. And so we see that as like, you can't, not that you can't, but in our point of view, there's a big opportunity cost if you decouple that rewards and loyalty experience from the coffee consumption experience. That is such a frequent relationship-based thing. So we have, with Joe, we have it to where folks can earn and redeem points, and then we actually, pay for offers on our budget to get folks to order more often and give them discounts on higher average ticket items so they can try it once and that kind of a thing. We think it's immensely important. And the other piece of that is because coffee is such a routine relationship-based thing, de facto, you go to the shops that are your favorite, right? You support the businesses that you want. And by being in sort of the network, you take the approach, they can redeem those anywhere. But we see 80%-ish of all transactions, folks go to the same place, right? It's when they're on the weekend or they're on the other side of town or their context changes where they want to be able to open up an app and order from a place that isn't Starbucks. They look to us. But to your point, that loyalty, those experiences, and thinking about how you make that increasingly rich and meaningful, and I think differentiated. There's ways you can do it. We give shops tools to use their own budgets and create their own promo codes and deals and things like that, and market them in ways that are unique and differentiated to their shop. Really highlight aspects of their menu that they feel nobody else has or that are really differentiated and unique, and use Joe as a tool to really differentiate themselves. So 100% agree. I think that's something you really, really should focus on.
Awesome. Did I see, Dan, were you trying to add something there, or you look like you were? Okay. It's hard not being in person and reading facial expressions from people. So I'm going to go to the questions here again. And this is a question from Serena. One of the biggest imbalances, speaking from a New York perspective, for independent coffee companies is the lack of leverage and negotiating power with landlords. As we think about powering small businesses with big business tools, any advice on this?
I'll post this in the channel or I'll give it to Nick to follow up. But we found, I think, really compelling list of major brands not paying their rents to give to landlords. And we put together a package of abatement deferment agreements that people could send, because it's the current metaphor doesn't work at all. And I agree that the leverage is very difficult, but at the end of the day, push come to shove, those landlords can't have an empty hole in their building. They just need to find a way to keep their, as Dan would say, their PE people behind them, not chewing them out. So there's some techniques to sort of make them feel like they haven't changed their underwriting loans, but they're getting a break. And we've seen, at least out of the sort of couple hundred shops we have in New York, most of them get at least a 50% deferment and an abatement for almost as much if you negotiate it well.
Okay, excellent. That's good news. So you said you're going to share something in the chat about that. Okay.
I'll have to send it to Nick later, but he'll get out to everybody.
Okay, right. Yeah, because the chat is not wide open there. So thank you for that. And then another question here. This is a question from Clayton. How can we, the suppliers, better support our coffee shop customers? Any advice for suppliers?
I feel like I'm talking a bunch, but so we deal with a lot of suppliers. We are a supply line company to help coffee shops get, good supplies. I would say as a supplier, your world's definitely an incredible challenge, but betting on the coffee shop's longevity, trying to give them the best terms that you can, not increasing your minimums, not increasing your delivery drop fees, just muscling it through. I think you'll make it on the other side when the markets rebound. And what we do in New York is we put all of our vendors together into one truck, which turned out to save everybody a lot of money. Maybe you guys can grassroot that in the market you're in to try to save on some costs. It's a lot to drive everyone's stuff in.
Yeah, I think we need to vet each other and promote each other, not necessarily to make money, but just to help out those independent coffee shops. And I think we need to vet each other on those values things, like where do we come through, because it's very difficult for an independent coffee shop to vet every single supplier, every single vendor that they need. It's a lot of work, and also there's a lot of change. For example, in my industry, if I look at the top 5 companies in my industry, the average number of name or ownership changes over the 17 years that we've been in business is probably like 4. And so there's this insane kind of round robin, like fly by night, like approach to certain things in my industry. I don't think it's as bad in other industries. I think mine's one of the worst, but this idea of like kind of getting a bunch of customers, then cashing out and kind of having the business die is something to stay away from. And I think we can just help our customers by, without having any financial incentive, literally just introducing each other to the customer so that they can have the best experience possible. Because ultimately, if the independent coffee shops are doing well, then all of us are going to be doing well also.
Just to add to that, I think from our perspective, I think suppliers can play a really great role in, just like the folks on this panel, you have insight into data and your sell-through, and you can get some sort of pulse on who's doing well, and then taking the step of understanding the why and getting those learnings and those kinds of technologies and things like that to the other folks so you can help them. I think that it's a unique position to be in, and you can sort of step up as an educator and an enabler.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, we're right at time. It's 11:59. And I want to, again, thank the panel. We have Dane Atkinson, CEO of Odeco, Andrew Ramirez, Trends and Insight expert from Tarani, Dan Price, thank you, founder and CEO of Gravity Payments, and of course, Dick Martin, CEO of Joe. So thank you all for your insights and all of your inventive thinking and the empathy and the compassion that you're bringing to this discussion and the desire to help these small business owners really be able to survive this and in the future thrive. So thank you all for your comments, and thank you all for the attendees for being with us today. And you'll get a copy of the recording. So thank you so much, everybody.
And thank you, Angie McKenzie, for facilitating us. Great job, and really appreciate
Thank you, Angie.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was an honor.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
It's fun being here.